Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a story from Midland, Texas today.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it's a recent piece from the Midland Reporter-Telegram, and it caught my eye because it involves the Salvation Army, a pretty hefty grant, and efforts to combat veteran homelessness.
Definitely a topic that deserves attention.
For sure, and I think you'll agree the details are really what make this one stand out. So to set the scene a bit, this grant awarded to the Salvation Army chapter, there is a whopping $260,000.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right, that's a lot of zeros dedicated to getting folks off the streets and back on their feet.
No kidding. That kind of money can be life-changing for someone experiencing homelessness, especially when it's paired with the right support systems.
And that's exactly what caught my attention. The article talks about how this isn't just about temporary housing.
Right, it's not just a Band-Aid solution.
Exactly, it goes deeper, talking about providing extended stay shelter support, along with furnished housing, and even help navigating the often complicated world of disability benefits.
Now, those are some crucial wraparound services that can really make a difference in the long run.
Right, it's like they've thought about the whole picture.
Absolutely. And understanding why those specific services matter requires understanding the challenges many veterans face when they return to civilian life.
So walk us through that. What are some of those challenges that might lead to a veteran experiencing homelessness?
Well, for one, many veterans return with both visible and invisible wounds.
Right, PTSD being a big one we hear about often.
Exactly, and that can make it incredibly difficult to hold down a job, adjust back to civilian life, or even just cope with day-to-day stressors.
And on top of that, there's the potential for physical injuries that require ongoing care and limited employment options.
You got it, and suddenly the transition home becomes that much harder.
It really paints a picture of how someone could end up in a really tough spot, even if they're coming from a place of service and dedication.
Absolutely, and that's where this grant comes in. It recognizes that veterans often just need a bit of a hand up, not a hand out.
So how do those specific services we mentioned, the extended stay, furnished housing, and benefits, help address those unique challenges?
Well, think of it this way. That extended stay shelter provides stability, a safe environment where someone can start addressing those deeper challenges, whether it's PTSD, job hunting, or anything in between.
It gives them a chance to breathe and regroup.
Exactly. And then you add in furnished housing, which takes a huge financial burden off their shoulders.
Right, because even if you can afford rent, coming up with first month, last month, and a security deposit on top of furniture is a huge barrier.
Exactly. And then on top of that, navigating disability benefits, especially if you're dealing with trauma or physical challenges, it's a whole other hurdle.
And having someone there to guide you through that process can be invaluable.
Absolutely. It's about removing those barriers and giving veterans the resources to rebuild their lives.
It seems like the Salvation Army is really trying to break that cycle of homelessness rather than just provide a temporary fix.
I think that's a really important point, and it's something that the article highlights too.
Right. I remember that quote. Something about how veterans experiencing homelessness are often more ready and able to exit homelessness when given the right support.
Exactly. And there's a reason for that. Well, it goes back to that idea of veterans often having this incredible inner strength and resilience.
Yeah, that really resonated with me from the article, this idea that they're not falling into homelessness because of some personal failing.
Right. It's not about a lack of character or willpower.
Exactly.
It's often about the unique challenges they face when transitioning back to civilian life after serving their country.
And how those challenges aren't always acknowledged or understood by society at large.
Exactly. Think about it. These are individuals who've often lived in a very structured environment, used to discipline, used to having a mission.
Right, a purpose.
Exactly. And then they return home, and that structure isn't always there. They're expected to seamlessly integrate back into a world that might feel completely foreign to them now.
It's no wonder that transition can be so jarring for some.
Absolutely. And for some, it can lead to a sense of displacement, disorientation, even a loss of identity. But, and this is crucial, the inherent strengths that veterans possess, those often shine through when given the right support.
Which makes those success stories all the more powerful, right? Like the one in the article about them already housing a veteran in a family of 9.
Absolutely. That's what this is all about, tangible outcomes.
Proof that this approach works.
Exactly. And it also highlights something else that's really important, the ripple effect that these kinds of programs can have.
Right. It's not just about the individual, it's about the family unit, the community as a whole.
Precisely. When one person finds stability, it radiates outwards.
And that even ties back into something the Salvation Army officer mentioned, about how helping veterans ultimately frees up resources to help other homeless individuals in Midland.
There it is. That interconnectedness is so important to recognize.
Right, because it challenges that us versus them mentality that can sometimes surround these issues.
It's not about picking and choosing who deserves help. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
And that helping one group often lifts up others in the process.
Exactly. And speaking of community, it's interesting that this story comes out of Midland, Odessa, a region known for its strong military ties.
Right. It made me wonder if that context plays a role in their approach to tackling veteran homelessness.
Oh, absolutely. When you have a large veteran population, there's often a heightened awareness of the challenges they face.
And likely a greater sense of responsibility to address those challenges.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes personal. It's one thing to read about veteran homelessness as some abstract issue in a far-off place.
Right. It's another thing entirely when it's your neighbor, your friend, your coworker's son.
Exactly. And that personal connection, it can be a powerful motivator for change.
It makes me think about our listeners out there, many of whom might be veterans themselves or have veterans in their lives.
Absolutely. And they might be wondering, what can I do? How can I help?
Exactly. So for those who are feeling that call to action, what advice would you give them? Where do they even begin?
Well, a great first step is simply connecting with the resources that already exist. I always recommend checking out the Texas Veterans Commission. They have a wealth of information on their website.
So it's about tapping into that network, seeing who's already doing the work on the ground.
Exactly. They can connect you with local organizations, support groups, volunteer opportunities, all sorts of ways to get involved.
So finding that entry point that feels right for you.
Yes. And remember, even small acts of kindness can make a world of difference.
Like what? What are some examples of small but meaningful actions people can take?
Well, it could be something as simple as offering a meal to someone experiencing homelessness or donating gently used clothing to a local shelter.
Those everyday acts of compassion can really add up.
Exactly. Or even just taking the time to listen to a veteran's story, to show them that you see them, you hear them, you value their service.
It's about recognizing their humanity, their worth.
Beautifully said. And this story about the Salvation Army grant, it's a perfect example of that, of a community coming together to recognize the humanity of its veterans and to offer them a path forward.
It's both inspiring and hopeful. Now, while this story is incredibly positive, and rightfully so, I do think it's important to acknowledge the bigger picture here. This grant is fantastic, but $260,000, while generous, is a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of veteran homelessness nationwide.
That's a really important point. We can't lose sight of the systemic issues at play here.
Right. So as much as we celebrate these individual victories, we also have to ask ourselves, what else needs to be on our radar? What are some of those root causes of veteran homelessness that we need to be thinking about if we want to create lasting change?
That's where things get even more complex, but it's a conversation worth having.
It feels like we've been talking about two sides of the same coin, right? Like on one hand, there's this immediate need to get veterans off the streets, to provide those essential support services.
Absolutely. Those immediate needs are crucial.
But then there's this whole other layer of like, okay, but how do we prevent veterans from ending up in that situation in the first place? What are those root causes we need to be addressing?
Exactly. And it's impossible to talk about homelessness for veterans or anyone, really, without addressing the elephant in the room: affordable housing.
Right. That's not just a veteran issue. That's a societal issue.
Exactly. It affects us all, but it's especially tough for vulnerable populations, and veterans are definitely part of that.
Because if you're struggling to keep a roof over your head, everything else becomes that much harder.
Precisely. It's like trying to build a life on a foundation of sand. It's just not sustainable.
And I imagine that's even more challenging for veterans who might be dealing with service-related injuries, whether physical or mental.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another critical piece of the puzzle: access to quality mental health care.
Which, let's be honest, even for those without the added layer of military service, navigating the mental health care system in this country can feel like its own battle.
Oh, tell me about it. It's a maze out there, and for veterans, there's often an added layer of stigma.
Right, that whole suck it up, be tough mentality.
Yeah.
That unfortunately still pervades many aspects of military culture.
Exactly. We need to shift that narrative, make it clear that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
It's about recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health.
100%. And we need to back that up with accessible, affordable, and timely mental health care services for our veterans.
So it's kind of like this two-pronged approach, right? We need to address those immediate needs, provide that safety net so veterans aren't falling through the cracks, but we also need to be tackling those systemic issues that are contributing to homelessness in the first place.
Nailed it. It's about creating lasting solutions, not just temporary fixes.
And that brings us back to something that's been a recurring theme throughout this whole deep dive, the power of community.
Right. It's not just about government programs or big organizations. It's about everyday people stepping up and saying, how can I help?
Exactly, because those small acts of kindness, when multiplied, can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most impactful thing we can do is simply listen, offer a kind word, or a helping hand.
It's about recognizing the humanity in every single person, regardless of their circumstances.
Beautifully said. And that's what I hope people take away from this conversation, that sense of shared humanity and responsibility.
It's been an incredible journey exploring this story, and I really appreciate you joining me for the ride, for lending your expertise to these really important issues.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. We hope this deep dive has inspired you to think differently, to ask questions, and to find those small or big ways to make a difference in your own communities. Until next time, stay curious and keep those conversations going.